Я не бачу. Ой, Боже.
Так працюють російські ракети. Почався обстріл Івано-Франківського аеродрому.
On the 25th of February 2022, Vladimir Putin announced the start of a special military operation inside the territorial boundaries of Ukraine. Minutes later, bombing of civilian structures and infrastructure commenced in Ukraine, shocking the West and terrorizing Ukrainian citizens. What followed was a rush for the capital, as Russia sought to begin the conflict strong, mirroring operations conducted by the United States in Iraq at the turn of the millennium. Ideally for the Kremlin, they would march into the capital and establish a new government immediately, sidestepping as much conflict as possible. With the might of one of the most hyped militaries in the world, Ukraine stood little chance. It was only a matter of time Russia's plan would succeed. Except, that's not what happened. Russia quickly gained a territory, but once encountered with a city, and by extension actual resistance, the entire operation grinded to a complete halt. So what's going on? Why has Russia invaded Ukraine? And what is the true plan? Where do we go from here? Putin's claims. Vladimir Putin has been on record as saying that Ukraine is a fundamental part of Russia, as both countries come from the same origins. It's clear though that looking at the history of Ukraine, that's not entirely true. Human inhabitation of Europe started as humans crossed what is modern-day Crimea and Ukraine into the continent. From there they began to establish distinct nomadic cultures that settled the area. Eventually the Goths established as the primary culture, with the Kiev culture to the north. Afterwards the Huns dominated the area until the Goths regrouped and helped the Roman Empire defeat the Huns. From there Goths left and settled in Pannonia. In the wake of the Goths, the remnants of Kiev culture re-emerged as Slavic tribes. Eventually this led to the Antes Union, which saw these Slavic tribes migrate and establish the early seeds of many Slavic nations, including Russia. Of course, since this time, Ukraine has been conquered many times for hundreds of years. During this time, we saw the rise of Moscow, which eventually transformed into what we recognize as Russia, with the establishment of the Tsardom of Russia, which led to the Russian Empire. We've seen that Russia and Ukraine being the same isn't true, as it's more accurate to say Ukraine led to the creation of Russia. However, after the Russian Empire came the revolution that led to what Putin most likely refers to, which is the Soviet Union in 1922. It was during this revolution that led to a Ukrainian push for national identity, leading to several Ukrainian states. Western Ukraine was conquered by Poland, while another Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, then became a founding member of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. This is likely what Vladimir Putin refers to when he says Ukraine and Russia are one and the same, though this claim is dubious at best, as there are many factions within a fractured Ukraine fighting for different causes. Besides the claims being extremely dubious, it does reveal Putin's line of thinking to an extent that he has been obsessed with nationalism from an early age. Even during his high school years, he contacted the Soviet Union intelligence agency, the KGB, and what he can do to better his chances of being accepted into the organization. After given some advice, he was told not to contact the agency again. Ironically, the silence was broken by the KGB itself, as they decided to bring Vladimir into the organization once his study of law has finished. His time spent in the KGB is extremely embellished, which tells us that Vladimir is quite conscious of how he's perceived by the public. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the KGB came to an end. With this turn of events, Putin decided to enter politics. Putin's rise to power. His career in politics is probably the most revealing about the man's ambitions. Almost immediately, Putin was the subject of multiple investigations of corruption. He was tasked with facilitating trade and establishing industry in St. Petersburg, a position he used to favor particular businesses willing to offer him kickbacks. A facade company, Gunvor, was established in Sweden. This company acted as a middleman for foreign oil trades, essentially taxing the economic activity. Putin's childhood friend likely acts as a proxy, as he holds a large share in the bank despite having no history to support his investment. Putin left St. Petersburg when the mayor he served under lost an election. He since moved to Moscow. While there, former KGB co-agents appointed Putin as the deputy chief of the Presidential Property Management Department. During this time, he used his influence to run a smear campaign against the then Russian Federation President Yeltsin's most influential and critically vocal opponent. In exchange for this service, Yeltsin appointed Putin as interim president in 1999 when he resigned. With the turn of the millennium, Putin was protected during the election by officials aligned with him, and he served for 2 terms as president, became prime minister in 2012, and became president once more since. His time as the president is marked by his push to nationalize many nationwide industries and appointed those who helped his progress in charge of said industries, as well as fostering an increased sense of nationalism and identity through the Russian Orthodox Church. He has spent billions of dollars constructing a palace, and has focused on renewing the Russian military to its former Soviet glory. With Putin seemingly obsessed with wealth and power, and him being on record saying that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy in history, it seems as though Putin idealizes previous incarnation of Russia for the power that they once held. While many suspect he wants to revitalize the Soviet Union, and they're likely not wrong, I suspect this is too simplistic. He seems to idolize and shape his regime after the Tsardom that preceded the Soviet Union. It seems as though he wants to create a Russian state that has the territorial and militaristic strength of the Soviet Union, but with the traditional Orthodox and royal influence in the structure of government. The result is an odd mishmash of the Tsardom and Soviet Union. Precipice for War. Economically, Russia has been devastated by the hoarding of wealth and the foreign policy of Putin's regime and established oligarchs. With Russia being a house of cards, the immediate solution on the part of the commoner is to create an imbalance and destabilize such a house. In order to prevent this, Putin has campaigned extensively to win the hearts of the Russian people, and to harshly shut down criticism by any means necessary. The annexation of Crimea was even suspiciously during a period of deteriorating public perception of Putin, which then resulted temporarily in an increase of positive perception domestically. Simultaneously, there exists a balance of power between Putin and the oligarchs built of mutual benefits. If Putin fails to serve the oligarchs, it's safe to say they can destabilize his political career and appoint someone else that will serve their interest. With the Russian economy tanking over the last decade, it's become more and more dependent on energy exports. This is famously a volatile source of revenue, as oil and gas prices can vary wildly and do crash often. Even then, additional oil and gas procurement is shifting to the Arctic regions, making it extremely expensive and difficult to exploit these resources. Ideally, a large amount of natural resources that the entire globe is dependent on, with a poor population that will make labor and procurement extremely cheap, would benefit the oligarchs the most in maintaining their status. Enter Ukraine. Ukraine is a poor nation, having struggled for hundreds of years to maintain its identity from one occupation to another. It is rich in natural resources, like the world's largest supply of titanium, and over 90% of the neon used to produce silicon wafers, and produces a massive abundance in agricultural goods. That said, the nation isn't developed enough to exploit its many resources on a truly massive scale. It is entirely possible Russian industries could exploit these resources on a much more massive scale, while costing extremely little in overhead due to the not quite as hostile environment compared to the Arctic, and the low wage rates required to pay Ukrainians. War breaks out. For months, Russian netizens posted massive amounts of Russian military equipment being shipped by train. The staging area was right next to the Ukrainian border. Officially, Russia's military was conducting a massive military readiness exercise. However, with the clock ticking on Putin's regime in regards to an economic downturn and subsequent decrease in public perception, that explanation was almost universally recognized as bogus. Once medical and fuel stations were set up, that showed the Russian military was planning to occupy the location long term. Sure enough, the Russian military invaded Ukraine, immediately gunning for the capital Kiev. However, almost immediately something appeared to be strange about this attack. It would have been in Russia's best interest to have taken Ukraine in a matter of days before the West could truly react. Typically, this means simultaneous attacks on infrastructure and air assets. Instead, we saw limited air support from aging MiG-29s. While typical of them to use unguided weapons, they immediately targeted civilians. Russian advances essentially sidestepped cities entirely, leaving logistics open to attack. Reports of Russian vehicles getting stuck, destroyed, and even stolen by farmers increased by the day. An attack on an important air base by Russian paratroopers ended in a disaster when 11 of the 15 helicopters were shot down. While the 4 remaining helicopters took the air base for a night, a counterattack swiftly expelled them. What the entire globe considered to be the second most powerful military on the planet essentially stalled and broke down and accomplished nothing. The Russian invasion, as it stands currently, has failed. More forces are gathering for another wave of attacks, but the effort has stalled as more vehicles get stuck and wait for fuel. The Russian economy, already extremely volatile coming into the conflict, has been hit with economic sanctions, essentially crippling it. The Russian stock market hasn't opened in a week, and the ruble is now worth less than a penny, with double-digit inflation rates. If you had asked me before, I would have told you that Russia would have conquered Ukraine within 4 days, with the difficult occupation to then contend with. Instead, we've seen one of the shortest projection of power gradients in the history of warfare, and has served to be the biggest embarrassment in Russian history. Where do we go from here? Predicting the future is going to be exceptionally tricky. Depending on how the next wave of attacks succeeds, Russia may take control of Ukraine. Even then, they will have a difficult time with the occupation due to anti-Russian sentiment. That said, it's clear Putin will likely not be in power after 2024, barring some extreme election tampering, which isn't out of the question. However, with the public seemingly hostile towards Putin's regime and dissatisfied with decades of economic hardship, it's easy to imagine Russia fading into chaos for the foreseeable future. While they will never be irrelevant due to the nuclear stockpile, it's easy to see Russia fade into geopolitical obscurity by 2050, taking the once developing Ukraine with it. Ukraine has essentially been set back decades at this point, regardless of whether or not Russia keeps it. Simultaneously, the United States has become more and more isolationist in sentiment. With Russia essentially shooting itself in the foot, it's likely the United States will seek to separate itself from Europe. It's doubtful it'll happen completely, but it likely won't be to the scale that it is today. Before the crisis, NATO was seemingly already beginning this process. The irony is, if Putin did nothing, NATO likely would have remained in name only. Instead, its resolution has temporarily been increased for the time being. Meanwhile, the United States will be focused more on the Asian theater. China is likely to begin its decline soon as well, with the real estate sector already crashing. The developed world likely isn't far behind, as economic growth has been at an unsustainable rate. The standard of living has been maintained by debt and steady inflation and is clearly hitting a boiling point. Russia seems to be on the downtrend, followed by China. However, the EU and the United States are not far behind. It seems we're coming upon an age of serious contention in all parts of the globe, and this is likely to act as a sort of global reset of sorts. This has already been seen with Japan. While public debt is still massive, it seems a declining population has naturally occurred, while GDP has remained somewhat stable. This has allowed for the quality of life to remain at least mostly what it was, though problems definitely exist. It's likely this is what we're going to see going into the future. That said, there are many factors that go into predicting the future, and perhaps things will delay or accelerate this timeline. As mentioned before, we're likely to see increased chaos as things play out over time. By 2050, hopefully things will have settled down, but we'll see. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this content. We aim to make complex topics simple and digestible to the common viewer. If you enjoyed this content, consider subscribing. In the meantime, enjoy your dance with the angels.